Conservation Partnership. Lee Livingston, an outfitter and commissioner of Livingston Outfitting and commissioner for Park County, Wyoming. And we have Sara Brodnax, manager of Habitat Markets for the Environmental Defense Fund. Thank you all for being here, and I will turn it over to Ed.
Great, thanks very much, David. Good morning to everyone. I want to first start by thanking Governor Meade for spawning this initiative and the Western Governors Association for hosting these workshops and allowing me to participate. The Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership is a national nonprofit sportsmen's conservation organization that works to guarantee all Americans quality places to hunt and fish. We work with numerous sportsmen's groups and conservation organizations like Wildlife Management Institute, Mule Deer Foundation, National Wild Turkey Federation, and many, many others. Our goal is to bring a collective voice for conservation of fish and wildlife habitats, sportsmen's access, and other key issues into the natural resources policy arena, and one that advances our outdoor heritage and sporting traditions. Now, today I'm speaking solely on behalf of the TRCP, but I will point out that I've had many a conversation on these issues with our partners and key points. I think we align pretty well philosophically, at least at the broad perspective that I'm going to present, which hopefully helps tee up some of the other discussion here. We believe the Endangered Species Act certainly has been a critical piece of conservation legislation in America, but by very nature of its name, its enactment and implementation would imply that a situation has gone far down the wrong path. Sportsmen have a long and storied history with this situation. If we think back to the late 1890s, early 1900s, many species of wildlife were near the brink of extinction and seriously in jeopardy, passing the point of no return, potentially, as did the passenger pigeon. But I think it's important to point out that at that time in our history, had we had legislation like the Endangered Species Act, species like white-tailed deer, mule deer, black bear, elk, bison, wild turkeys, all would have been candidates potentially for listing. They would have met the criteria. So thanks to visionary leaders like Theodore Roosevelt, many others, mostly in the hunting and fishing community, we were able to reverse those trends with both reactive and proactive conservation as well as legislation. Reactive efforts to reverse the dire situations that many of those species and their habitats faced, including the elimination of market hunting and establishment of game laws, but proactive efforts that sustain conservation today. And this leads me to perhaps my most important point regarding the ESA. While we certainly agree there are some reasonable reforms that will likely improve the effectiveness of the ESA and its implementation, we believe the very best solution to improving the Act is to avoid having to use it in the first place. The future of species conservation has to focus on proactive collaboration that we've heard many times, but it needs to utilize that landscape scale, science-based approach to conserve ecosystems and multiple species well in advance of needing to list them in the first place. I've already mentioned the successes we've had with game species, but we've also heard some recent examples. Gary mentioned the New England cottontail, but there are others, grayling, and of course the greater sage grouse, which we have heard many times already, and we'll hear more, I suspect, today. These are examples that have a common thread. Proactive engagement from multiple stakeholders in the development of conservation measures and assurances that their implementation that are needed to preclude the need to list will happen. However, they also have another common thread, and there was still that regulatory hammer that loomed over the various stakeholders and forced the conversations and actions. I think that's where we need to break away and make a change in the paradigm shift. We have that shift undergoing. We have new and effective ways of addressing species conservation. But we still have that problem and challenge of getting ahead of the regulatory curve and getting all stakeholders to participate meaningfully well in advance of habitat and population trends, reaching that proverbial tipping point where it triggers a petition to list or potentially end up with a listing. Delaying action has repeatedly led us to petitions and potential and actual listings, and I'll give you a couple of examples. First of all, northern spotted owl. I happen to be working in the Pacific Northwest when the species was listed. I also worked for a Fortune 500 timber company several years after the species was listed. And I can tell you there were very credible sources that warned the timber industry long in advance that there was a brewing condition and situation with Northwest forests in that particular region, all the way back in the mid-1970s. But we didn't step back and necessarily proactively address that. In fact, exponential timber harvest increased, occurred from probably about 1983, until the bird was listed, and we know the rest of the story, and the bird still is on the list. And we have other examples with lesser prairie chickens and greater sage grouse. We knew a while back, with good science and trends in populations and habitat loss, that we were in need of some action. So I'll take the opportunity certainly to commend Wyoming. They are a great example where we got ahead of the looming regulatory hammer that reared again in 2010 and put forward action and moved all stakeholders in the right direction and got us to where we are today with a not warranted decision. The 5-state planning effort for lesser prairie chickens, another great example of collaborative conservation, but one that, again, was warned about all the way back to 1995, and unfortunately one that manifested during a time of severe drought and continued steep population declines. But those plans are under implementation now, and that is a key point in all of this, is that they're still being implemented. But my real key point here is this proactive conservation strategy is to really going to work and thwart off an ESA. We've got to get much better at getting ahead of the curve and earlier in the process, until that not winding up in a situation of waiting for that looming regulatory hammer to drive the need for action. This is a challenge that I see in making conservation a long-term investment. It has to be a long-term investment and not the proverbial impediment, a quarter by quarter or year to year nice to have, or when discretionary funds are available, or something that only gets considered when the risk of regulation is front and center. That's going to require change and sacrifices on the front end of the process and creative opportunities to incentivize that new way of doing business for all stakeholders. It's a key challenge to me, and I think as I see it, and a fundamental outcome of what we can accomplish here today at this workshop and other workshops that are forthcoming, is trying to better define that investment and some specific ideas and incentives to build off what we've learned for all stakeholders and engaging them earlier in the process and working toward those long-term common goals proactively, as opposed to ending up yet again in a reactive model all the while blaming the ESA. However, once a species is listed, we certainly agree and feel strongly that, as many do, there are clearly issues with getting species off the list, and this starts first and foremost, as has been discussed already, with good recovery plans that are timely and successful. And to this end, I can't overstate the importance of having clear science-based and measurable goals for habitat and populations that should trigger a delisting once they've been met in a timely fashion without endless delay, litigation, and moving the goalposts. We've heard Governor Meade say that, as well as others. Now, there have been some recent advancements on the petitioning rulemaking that's already been listed. I'm not going to cover that, but those are all steps in the right direction. But we also should not forget about issues surrounding the lack of active management on public lands. We have to be able to actively manage habitats to conserve species and manage for diversity across the landscape. We also have dwindling budgets that inhibit good wildlife management and conservation. We need to deal with things like catastrophic wildfire and other things that starve budgets and their ability to do work. And all of these issues have to be considered because they inhibit our ability to conserve species and getting ahead of that proverbial regulatory curve. And I appreciated Sherry bringing up conflicting issues with golden eagles and sage grouse. There are also potentially conflicting policies. We're focused today and throughout these sessions on ESA, but we need to think more holistically about conflicting policies that may impede our good intentions and work through the ESA. And I'm not even going to mention, but I think we all know a lot of different policies that could have impacts on our good intentions in dealing with the ESA. So we need to look at all things more holistically. So I'll reiterate that Sportsmen have a long history of success with species conservation. And reflecting back on that history, we not only reversed the trends of the almost nearly extinct game species in this country, but even as important, we established a system of conservation funding and an economic engine that contributes billions of dollars to our economy. This is unlike anything else in the world. And as a colleague of mine, Shane Mahoney, often says, and this is a Canadian, mind you, he reminds us that this is one of the greatest pieces of American genius in history. And we don't tout it enough, and we should learn from it and use it in our future. We need to explore those successes to develop expanded resources and opportunities for conservation. And to that end, Sportsmen stand ready to help move this discussion forward, maintain and enhance the original intent of the ESA, which was to conserve ecosystems and species before they warrant petitioning and potential listing. And with that, I appreciate the opportunity to share those perspectives, and I look forward to our conversations and getting into more details today with the diverse stakeholders that are here and in the future. Thanks. I too would like to thank Governor Meade and the Western Governors Association for hosting this forum and for everyone coming out here to listen to us speak about our experiences with the ESA. I think what we've heard a little bit before now is some of the 30,000 foot elevation view of it. I'd like to share some personal experiences with the ESA. As David said before, I'm a Park County Commissioner here. My job that pays the bills, though, is that of an outfitter in the mountains here around Cody. I first went to hunting camp around here in 1975 when I was 9 years old. I now own that camp along with a few others and have been professionally guiding and outfitting around here for 30 plus years. Every year my business takes over 100 clients to the backcountry of Wyoming to hunt, fish, enjoy the wildlife, and enjoy the mountains. And my profession allows me to spend vast amounts of time in the backcountry around Yellowstone. And my business is very dependent on the health of Wyoming's land, water, and wildlife. Coincidentally, that same year that I first went in hunting camp was the first year that the grizzly bear was listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. At the time, there were thought to be only 130 grizzlies in the Yellowstone region. 40 years later, here we are. Estimates are there are over 700 grizzlies now in this region, and they are very self-sustaining. By all accounts, conservation efforts work, until the grizzly remains listed as threatened. As an outfitter, I've also witnessed the introduction and listing of the gray wolf here in Wyoming and surrounding states. We started with, some would say, around 0 in 1994, and the latest wolf population estimates put the number well over 400 wolves and growing. Here again, we've witnessed a population recovery that is by all accounts a success, and here again, the wolf remains on the endangered species list. During all this time, I have seen firsthand the impacts the listing of the grizzly and the wolf has had on my industry. There's no doubt that both the grizzly and the wolf have become icons for many. For my clients interested in wildlife watching, these apex predators are a big draw. My own website sells grizzly bear viewing as a bonus to taking a backcountry trip with them. The ESA has accomplished what it was intended to do with these two species, but for some reason the ESA does not allow for success. The federal government, by listing these animals under the ESA, basically brokered a deal with the people of Wyoming and surrounding states, wherein if we accepted new regulation changes and we changed our backcountry practices, once the grizzly and wolf reached healthy and recovered population levels, they would be delisted. By all accounts from the state and federal experts who manage these species, both species are fully recovered and have exceeded recovery criteria for over a decade. While there are always radicals on both ends of any hot button issue, the majority of the folks in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming accepted the new regulations and moved forward. They did so with the understanding that there was an end game in sight. The problems began to arise when first the federal government started moving the goalposts, and now the federal courts are moving the goalposts. Instead of celebrating the recovery of two species, we're locked in a legal battle with groups more interested in raising money and spending time in courtrooms than actually taking yes for an answer. That is why public tolerance has declined, and that is why federal congressional tolerance for the ESA has declined. As the Western Governors Association and others contemplate changes to the ESA, I encourage us to take a hard look at how difficult it is to delist a species. The goal of the ESA is to recover a species and delist them, not keep them on the list forever. On the one hand, we should recognize when the ESA has worked. On the other, we must also recognize the recovery of these species comes with cost. As the grizzly and wolf populations have grown, there has been a major reduction in elk hunting opportunities in the areas around Cody. This has resulted in a negative economic impact to the outfitters and related businesses here. There's an area not less than 30 miles from where we now sit, where a group of five outfitters, five businesses prior to 2010 historically hosted an average of 85 elk hunting clients amongst them, that are today hosting less than 25. Those numbers might mean little to some folks, but that kind of decline is unsustainable for a part of the tourism industry that is so important to the economy of Park County. In my opinion, this single species management is one of the primary flaws of the ESA. When considering a species status for delisting, there appears to be no consideration on the effects on other wildlife populations.
Single species management plans may work to recover that species, but they also have severe impacts on areas that have such diverse wildlife populations we do here. As I said before, while you might find a few radicals who believe the only good grizzly or wolf is a dead one, I believe most people realize they're an integral part of the wildlife ecosystem and go a long ways towards keeping our wilderness wild. However, we are growing weary of seeing them portrayed as the poster children of the Yellowstone ecosystem at the expense of other wildlife populations. Balanced wildlife management takes careful consideration of the entire ecosystem. Unfortunately, the ESA does not allow for that. The ESA has tunnel vision for only the species on the list, and heck with everything else. Western states should be allowed to have complete management control over species within their borders. The ESA is an effective tool to identify and protect species requiring listing, but it lacks the necessary components to delist in a timely and reasonable manner. And most importantly, to ensure that a delisted species stays delisted. The recent decision by Washington, D.C. Federal District Court Judge Amy Behrman Jackson clearly illustrates how this is a major flaw in the ESA. Judge Jackson acknowledged the Wyoming gray wolf populations were recovered, but were still restored ESA protection based on what most would say was arbitrary technicality. I know for a fact that Wyoming, and I'm sure it's the same with our surrounding states, has a deep pool of extremely talented wildlife managers. These people are close to the ground here. They understand the terrain, the animals, and the people. Maybe most importantly, they have a broad view of wildlife management, not the narrow view the ESA forces the federal wildlife managers to have. I realize that if a species is listed, management shifts to the federal government and it takes a delisting to get it back in the hands of the state. It is time for the ESA to write the final chapter and allow the state to do what it has been doing all along, and that is manage the grizzly and the wolf, and to do so with the support and approval, not the hindrance of federal oversight. But even before that, the ESA should allow for more input at the state and local level, from the petitioning process to management and to delisting. I believe it is time to go back to the drawing board and make the ESA more effective and suitable to the needs of the western states and their wildlife. When two fully recovered species remain on a list that says they are not recovered, it's time to make some changes. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lee, and thank you to the Governor and the Western Governors Association for having me here today. I work at Environmental Defense Fund, which is a national nonprofit. I'm typically based in Washington, D.C., but I've spent a lot of time in Wyoming, so I'm always thankful for the excuse to get back out here. At EDF, we recognize the need to work collaboratively with farmers, ranchers, forest landowners, industry, and government if we're going to solve the challenges that we do face to conserve our natural resources. EDF's catchline is finding the ways that work. We're looking for solutions that make good economic and environmental sense. What that means to me is things like conservation incentives for farmers and ranchers, and it means market opportunities for ecosystem services like species protection. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about one of those opportunities, habitat exchanges. But first I want to tell you a little bit more about why EDF came to work on exchanges as a solution. EDF has a long history of working on mechanisms to incentivize wildlife conservation. For example, EDF worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service to develop the Safe Harbor protections under the Endangered Species Act. Safe Harbor is a mechanism that ensures that landowners that do beneficial things for species will not face more regulatory burdens down the road just because they did good things. We pioneered this for the red-cockaded woodpecker, but today more than 600 landowners across the country are enrolled in Safe Harbor agreements on over 5 million acres of land in 26 states, protecting nearly 100 listed species. This is just to show that we feel that by working together with landowners, we have the best chance of recovering species, whether or not they need to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. So we're all here today to discuss the Endangered Species Act, and I do want to say this. The ESA plays an important role. It was created to save America's most at-risk wildlife, those that are in danger of disappearing. However, sometimes it functions like an emergency room. By the time a species is put on the endangered list, it's sometimes too far along in decline to be saved without intensive and expensive treatment. A lot of this could be avoided with a little bit more preventive care. So we all agree that we need solutions to recover species before it is too late. So what can we do? No doubt we'll hear a lot today about the great work happening over at the Department of Agriculture, about the work of states like Wyoming on species like the greater sage grouse. We also have market tools for species. This includes things like conservation banks and exchanges, and that's what I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about in depth. So, storytelling time. How did an Alabama girl, that's me, end up working on conservation issues in Washington, D.C. and spending a whole lot of time in Wyoming? Well, that story has a lot of parts, but I'm going to focus on the Wyoming piece. So a few years ago, landowners in the Upper Green River Basin were thinking about ways to be recognized financially for the stewardship that they provide for natural resources on their ranches. Some of them are in this room, so I won't put words in their mouth, but they reached out to folks at the local conservation district and others like the Nature Conservancy and the University of Wyoming to explore some ideas. So word got around that EDF had some tools that might be helpful, and we joined up to that effort. And the next thing I know, I'm spending a whole lot of time living in Wyoming, in Laramie, in fact. The effort continued to gain momentum, and we were joined by others like the stock growers. We've all been working together as partners over the last couple of years to see if there was a way to establish an exchange in this state. The Wyoming Exchange is initially focused on greater sagegrass. The idea is to expand it to include other resources like water and mule deer. Each exchange is designed collaboratively by working groups to make sure that the approach works for farmers and ranchers, for industry, and for the state regulators. EDF is just one of the contributors, and in this way, each exchange is unique. EDF is working on these tools across the landscape. You may hear Terry Finkhauser talk a little bit later about the exchange in Colorado, which is looking at sagegrass and mule deer. Our partners have also developed a sagegrass exchange called the Conservation Credit System in Nevada. We're working on some multi-species approaches in the Central Valley of California that will look at fish, Swainson's hawk, and songbirds, among others. And our next challenge, because we haven't tackled something challenging enough, is that we're looking to apply the concept to the monarch butterfly, which is found in most of the states of this country. So what is an exchange anyway? To understand exchanges, we need to talk a little bit about mitigation. The Endangered Species Act included a far-sighted provision that allows development to move forward as long as the damage can be offset by the protection of habitat for species elsewhere. This is called mitigation. If there are impacts to species that cannot otherwise be avoided or minimized, then we can offset or compensate for those impacts in a way that leaves the species better off. And so with that, an exchange is a market-based trading platform. It links multiple sellers who can provide benefit to habitat with multiple buyers interested in purchasing those benefits. The buyers are typically those such as oil and gas, pipeline, or other development companies that need to mitigate the impact of their activities on habitat. Or it can be others, like philanthropic buyers that are interested in purchasing credits for conservation reasons. The sellers can be landowners, including farmers and ranchers that protect and restore habitat. There's an exchange administrator that looks after the system and makes sure its credits are certified, verified, registered. The agencies are involved in terms of oversight, so it can be the state agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the BLM, and so on and so forth. Each exchange has a set of standard protocols and science-based metrics. The hope is to tie investments directly to conservation outcomes. And our hope and our idea in doing all of this is that we can get away from some of that one-off mitigation that was mentioned earlier and design the standards and protocols up front. And that way we can make the market more accessible to a wider range of participants, such as a rancher who just may not have the time or desire to design their own standards and create their own agreement with every state and federal agency that has an interest in this space. And believe me, there's a few of them. Finally, we hope this approach can save industry time and money by providing some predictability to the permitting process. And of course, at the end of the day, hopefully, make sure that species are better off. So what's next for exchanges? Our goal over the next year for the Sagegrass Exchange is to finalize approval with the agencies, get the operations up and running, and demonstrate the proof of concept through projects on the ground. We're currently seeking agency approval for sage-grouse exchanges in 3 states. It's Colorado, Wyoming, and Nevada. In Wyoming, we hired a pilot exchange administrator, Eric Peterson, whom some of you may know. He's working to go to ground to establish the exchange to get projects up and running. And we're working to align the exchange with the state framework that was recently released in the state. I'm guessing that Terry will tell you a little bit more about Colorado, so I'll end by telling you that in Nevada, the big focus is money on the ground. The state has committed $2 million to create habitat improvement projects that could one day become credit projects. And so those are some of the high points and just some ideas on ways that we can work collaboratively to find solutions. Thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thanks again, everybody, for your wonderful presentations. I would like to open it up. We have some time for questions, so I would like to open it up to the floor to take any questions for the panelists. Yes.
Thanks, David. I have a question for you. You were mentioning in your talk that after you thought that an agreement had been reached regarding wolves, that first the feds had moved the goalposts, then the federal courts. And I was wondering what you meant by first the feds moved the goalposts. How did that happen?
Just the struggle we had in getting Wyoming's plan accepted is kind of where I'm coming from, and not specifically related to the wolf in one specific instance, but it was a struggle getting Wyoming's plan accepted, and the efforts of Governor Meade were greatly appreciated in getting our plan accepted by the federal by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
So I have a question I proposed to all of the panelists, and we'll see if I may regret asking this question.
You may regret it too.
Right. Maybe that's the more appropriate way to put it. You'll regret me asking this question. The question I have for you is, I think it came up, I can't remember if it was one or two of you that mentioned it, but the increase of state and local involvement in the delisting and on the front end. And I guess my question to you is, do you have any suggestions or ideas for ways to increase that involvement, ways that could increase the involvement at the state and local level, both on the pre-listing side, but then also on the delisting side?
I guess I'll try to jump in the middle of that. I'm not exactly sure how we would go about increasing their acceptance of the state and local participation. I do believe we have, as I alluded to before, especially in Wyoming, we have a great band of wildlife managers, and it would be great to see their intelligence and their information utilized, prior to and afterwards. They're the ones. In Wyoming. The grizzly bear is where it is today because of Wyoming Game and Fish Department. They're the ones that have been figuring this out, and even going a little bit deeper as far as local participation. I spend, and a lot of my fellow outfitters spend a lot of time in the backcountry, and we see what goes on. And to see people reach out to the folks that are actually on the ground would be very refreshing. But I guess I didn't answer your question on how we get that to happen other than keep beating on the door.
No, sure, I have a lot to add other than I think, as Gary pointed out, there's a new rule on the pre-listing side of things to improve that coordination. The specific details, I think, have yet to play out, but the states certainly are cooperating agencies with all of these federal agencies, and I think it's, the proverbial improving our communications and understanding each other, but having genuine communication, really, to the acceptance point that Lee brought. I mean, there's checking the box kinds of communication and the real nitty-gritty detailed discussion and integration with the entities, and you have to be very sincere about that, better than we have in the past.
I think that's right, and I think when the opportunities and the need are clear, then I think that's when the states are able to step up. And I think we saw that very much so on grouse. There was good science. The conservation objectives team put forward what they saw as the threats to the species and the things that needed to happen, and that allowed the opportunity. There was some certainty that if certain actions were taken, that we'd be able to turn things around. And I think when there is some of that certainty, it provides that opportunity for people to be able to step forward.
I'm Matt Avery, Cameron County Commissioner from the other side of the state. And anyhow, I want to thank everybody for being on the panel there today. And Mr. Arnett, I like to direct a statement to you. It seems like that a lot of these things are so unbalanced. In other words, bird, on the West Coast put a lot of people out of business, and also developing unhealthy forests. And then this year we've had tremendous large forest fires. And so you can't have one thing if you don't take care of the other thing. And I think that through this whole deal, it's been, the focus point has been too much on one thing and not looking at the whole picture. And Lee and Sarah, I'm not being a county commissioner. My day job is a cattle rancher, and we deal with wildlife in our area. And as a landowner, I take it upon myself to protect different game species that's on my place. If the antelope and the deer populations are low, I don't take any hunters. I protect those animals until numbers are increased. And but anyhow, I think another way to look at restructuring the ESA is instead of putting a species on the list and then takes an act of Congress to get that species off the list once it's recovered. When I was in DC last spring at an ESA meeting there, the idea was brought up about if a species is listed, they can be on the list for like 5 years, and then it automatically comes off the list unless it can scientifically be proven that that species still needs to be on the list. And I think that is a good way to go about it, because right now, if things are put on the list, it's like it's there and forgot about. And it takes so much effort to get that species off the list. And I think if there was more effort onto proving that that species needs to be on the list, it would create some more balance there too. Thank you.
Yeah, just real quickly, I'd like to respond to your comment. I couldn't agree with you more. I might have been at a fairly high level on what I was getting at, but I completely agree with you. We have to look at these things holistically. And this transcends just about everything we think about or do regarding this. The policies interact with one another. The management can sometimes conflict. And that's why I brought up the lack of active management on public lands. That can be a real problem for a number of reasons for species and ecosystems, whether they're listed or not. So I'm in complete agreement with you.
I would agree with that as well. I think we need some of those system and landscape approaches so that we're looking across all of the things that we need. And to your comment on scientific proof, I think it's critically important that we invest in the data and the science that we need to make these decisions. We need a lot of research and a lot of information to be able to make good decisions, and that comes at a cost, but it's critically important.
I was having dinner with a colleague the other night, and he made mention of the highlighted comment. He said, if we trust the science going into a listing, we should trust it coming out on the delisting side as well. So I think there's a bit of wisdom in that statement.
Just a question. A number of panelists have talked about a multi-species approach, and I'm just wondering, I've been involved with single species conservation agreements, which take a significant amount of time. So adding on multiple species on a conservation agreement can bog down the whole process. So any ideas on how to streamline the process to add more species? Because I think that's the problem, is the more you add, the longer it takes. It just bogs down everything. So any ideas on how to streamline that whole process?
Well, in a listed context, you're right. I think a key point I was trying to make was let's look at conserving ecosystems and multiple species on the front end of the equation. And there's no greater example, in my humble opinion, than right now with what we did with sagebrush. That planning process and the conservation that will manifest in planning now for implementation should provide in what we some have heard and know as an umbrella approach to conserving habitat and processes for an entire ecosystem of over 350 species of plants and animals. And the goal would be to conserve the ecosystem to get the multiple benefits. In a listing process, you're right, it's a lot more difficult. I was involved with a multi-species HCP, and it layers a lot of complexity and problems with that. But I think if you back up to looking at that broader ecosystem, the processes, all the values you need to coalesce to get to the balance, and also have the conservation to get to a recovery and delisting, it can be done. It's more complicated.
Lyndon Bucher with American Colloid. I've got a question about mitigation, compensatory mitigation plans, and what I'm wondering is I see as a potential challenge is when it seems as though we're opening a door for potential businesses to open and purchase compensatory mitigation credits. And my question is can we have a system that's transparent where we know what the true situation is, and then as the species hopefully becomes, we can delist the species, are those businesses that built up around those credits, are they going to be willing to disband? At that point, we're talking about people's jobs and things like that. And I think we want to be careful about creating a business simply for the purpose of purchasing credits and then perpetuating the need for those credits.
Thank you for that comment. I think on the transparency side, we would wholeheartedly agree with you that that's critically important. One of our ideas is that if we can bring some of that transparency, that hopefully it will increase investment in the same way that transparent accounting did in the financial sector. So that's certainly a model that we're looking towards. In terms of the long-term prospects, I mean, it is important if we're mitigating for impacts that have permanence on the landscape, that we are assured that we have some kind of benefit that continues into the future and has permanence. So that at the end of the day, we do and we have confidence that things really are better off than they were before. So yeah, that's a challenge from a cost standpoint and an efficiency standpoint to make sure that we have the balance so that we can ensure that we have the long-term certainty that we're getting the habitat benefits that we need, while also not making it so unruly that it's awfully costly.
I think the comment strikes at a concept we've all heard but struggle understanding a little bit at times is adaptive management. And one of my perspectives, having been a biologist for probably 25 plus years now and living with the development of that theory and trying to see it in practice, is it has to go both ways. But it's really difficult. Not that I'm a business person, but I have worked for businesses and I understand this a little better than maybe some, but it's really difficult to have that certainty and assurance in a business model that allows that flexibility to go up or down. So to your point, after we get to a delisting, can we make some expansion? And the answer is, I would hope so. But also, if we find out new information that would allow for, that might require more mitigation and or restriction, or however you want to look at it, did we model it in a way to allow for that too? And that's really difficult because we don't always model the extremes, if you will, and they have to have sideboards. There's always going to be some financial limitation where we can't do anymore. And then that may lead into a different discussion or a different process. But that part of the adaptive process is very difficult for a business model, as I see it. And it's hard for managers and biologists and scientists to address that as well. So it's a very good question. And actually a complexity that I think is worth digging into a little deeper as we kind of look at solutions.
I think we have time for one more question. So this will be the last question for the panel, and I know there are others that might be interested, and I just ask that you catch up with the panelists, over lunch or this evening at a reception, or send them an email, or you can track them down. And I'll give you their personal home information.
Ethan Lane with the Public Lands Council and National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Staying with the mitigation aspect, I'm curious, Sarah, with the cost difference between direct engagement with landowners and some of the costs we've seen in the range like Livingston was a prairie chicken where you have a 2, 3, 4x multiplier between engagement with the mitigation banks and the landowners. How do you account for that going forward in the plans in Nevada and Wyoming and Colorado to make sure that that money does go directly to the ground and has the most impact possible?
So I think that also is, yeah, that's definitely something critical, and we want to make sure that we have the opportunity for landowners to be more directly engaged in the system, and that was part of our hope. The conservation banking model has done some really terrific things and set the bar for high standards, but it's expensive to get some of those systems up and running and to go through the process and get everything in place. And so our hope is that by putting some of the time and the thought into design of the system, that will make it more accessible so that the landowner can more directly participate. And perhaps it will be easier for them to work with an aggregator or a consultant to access the system, or perhaps it will be easier for them to just go directly to the system themselves. We're thinking through those approaches and want to make sure that we have the right balance there, but agree with you that it's important.
All right. Well, thank you everybody again for your great presentation.